Today, I'm going to talk about what prayer is.
Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher.
So this is in response to a question I got from a viewer. I want to mention that Bishop Barron has a really excellent video on prayer. I'm going to link it in the description. But so to answer the question of what is prayer, there are a lot of different ways of looking at this, which get at different aspects of what prayer is. So that is to say, they're describing the same thing, but in different sorts of ways. So if you start off with like a really simple, like the sort of thing you might give to a child, it captures a lot of what's correct. So talking to God being prayer. Although you have to bear in mind that the word to pray to some degree has a petitionary aspect, and you see this in older English, like, you'll see that phrase, I pray you, to a human being. So like you could pray to a human being in like the older English usage of the word prayer. It's not specifically about God. You can say like, in the same way as you can say like beseech, I beseech you, tell me I pray you. You'll see that like in Shakespearean usage, for example, where one person talks to another person. They're not analogizing it to God. It's an action. So there's an element in this, in the English word pray, that is, that is asking for something, that is petitionary in some sense. So you'll always tend to get shades of that as we look at prayer. So the phenomenon overall, this is one aspect of it. So in the same way that you can talk to a human being, you can talk to God. Now, there immediately becomes some complicated aspects to this, of course, because unlike with a human being, it's not possible to convey information to God that God doesn't already know. So one of the main aspects of speech, the communication of information, that's not really possible. I mean, it's possible to tell God what God already knows, but God already knows it so completely and perfectly and fully that repetition adds nothing. And so there becomes the immediate question of, what is the purpose in doing that? And I want to put that on hold for 1 second because it will elucidate this to look at it from a slightly different perspective as well. Because, as I alluded to a moment ago, there's also the petitionary aspect. You can ask somebody for something. That is to say, you can make the request of them that they do some action. Now, in some sense, this is, if you look at how we ordinarily do this in politeness, in polite ways of doing it, where you're not using a command form, what you do is you inform somebody that you would like it and then trust in their generosity and goodness that they would give it to you. If you look at like the polite form, like, would you pass me the salt? Well, the thing is that would in there is actually, I can't remember the grammatical tense, but it's it's like the subjunctive form or something like that of to will. Would you is, do you will to give this to me? Is it your will to give me the salt? Or to pass me the salt, is what would you pass me the salt is actually saying. It's taken on very much a ceremonial sort of thing. We don't use would you to mean do you will very often. So it sort of only has its ceremonial meaning, but that's where it actually comes from. That's the actual structure of what's being asked there. Other forms of it though, I would love some salt, is again informing somebody of something and trusting them to make a decision and so on. None of that obviously applies to God as well, because God already knows these things, and the command form, pass me the salt, really makes absolutely no sense at all when applied from us to God, because it's God's job to command us, not the other way around. So petitionary prayer, you can see, though it has that aspect of like we're asking for something, it runs into the problem of either it doesn't make sense in the command form, or it seems to be telling God something that God already knows. So, I'm going to deal with petitionary prayer. There are two aspects of petitionary prayer, both of which need to be dealt with, and I'm going to deal with them separately. One of them is about the efficacy of petitionary prayer. How on earth is this supposed to work? And the other is about the communicative aspect of it. So, I wanted to bring this in to see sort of the other side of prayer as talking to God. So the the aspect of, or the basic question which has to be answered here is, when you talk to God, what on earth are you doing? Because you're not actually giving God information. God already knows everything about everything. Okay, so what are you doing? Well, really, at a fundamental level, what you are doing is conforming your mind to God's knowledge of a thing. So when you say to God, thank you for, thank you for, well, actually, I'm sorry, prayers of thanks are another thing that I'll handle a little bit separately. They're another important one, but I was sort of jumping ahead by accident. Okay, so when you say to God, like, I really, I say I find this deeply stressful. I don't know what to do. Again, like, please tell me what to do, gets into the petitionary prayer, which I'll handle again in a moment, or I'll handle very shortly. But any of those things, contemplative prayer, by the way, also all falls into this, thinking about, like, it's, Lord, it's so strange that you decided to give this to this saint, or that you did this or did that, or what have you. All of those things, for example, within prayer. The expressing anger, you know, or wonder, mystification, etc. So, like, my God, why have you forsaken me? The start of Psalm 63, 93, 96. Oh man, I cannot believe this. It's the Psalm that Christ quoted when he was on the cross. But that one, people who are, expressing anger and so on. All of these things, they're not communicating anything to God, but by adopting the position of communicating this to God, what you're actually doing is bringing your mind into the state wherein essentially you're contemplating God's knowledge of the thing. Because ordinarily, and this is, through habit, the way we ordinarily call to mind, bring our minds into conformance to the knowledge of another, human being's knowledge of something, is by telling them. So, whether it's informative or simply calling to mind, like, how, you know, the World War II in some sense started with Germany launching a blitzkrieg through France. You are calling this to mind, but what you have done is, by stating it, you have brought this to mind of both parties, and so you now have that sort of meeting of the minds. The same thing applies. We have that same habitual thing. You're not calling anything to God's mind, because all things are, are present within God's mind. But you are calling it to your mind, and through this habit, you are comporting your mind to the knowledge of God. And so you are bringing yourself into thinking about what it is that God knows. And in so doing, by conforming your mind to God's knowledge, you are placing your mind into a mode, way, however you want to describe it, into a form to be receptive to God's knowledge coming to you. So it'd be fairly easy to either go one of two routes. Either to tend to view this in sort of like a magical way, as if you're opening up a line of communication where now, whereas it couldn't have happened before, like the thoughts will, like, magically pop up in your head. This is not what I mean. Similarly, you could also go the route of holding that, essentially this is all in your head. This is essentially just a way of thinking about things. This is to some degree like how Jordan Peterson might describe this kind of thing, or Jonathan Pajot, if he's trying to make it accessible as like a way for atheists to think about what's going on. It might be described all entirely as if it's all on your side. And that's not what I mean either. Jonathan Pajot would not be claiming it's all on your side. He would just be giving somebody a foothold to sort of get to the concept that way. And Jordan Peterson in general wouldn't be claiming that's all there is. He just tends to be completely agnostic as to whether there's anything more. In both cases, though, the thing, like that, without any of the other stuff, is not what I mean either. In conforming your mind to God's mind, so which makes you then receptive to God's thoughts. This will operate, of course, through the fullness of God's relationship to you. So, I mean, it is, of course, possible for God to manifest something straight up in the form of a voice, like, for example, Christ talking to Mother Teresa, where she actually heard his voice. It doesn't happen that way very often. It's certainly within the realm of the possible. But the thing you have to understand is that God formed us. God forms all things. God, in each moment, is creating all of creation in the way that it is. God is the one who put together the laws of physics and put together time and created all of the initial conditions and all of the the various non-deterministic events, of things like, or things where at least we certainly don't know that they're deterministic, and they certainly seem not to be deterministic, like, the electron double slit experiment and things like that. So quantum mechanics. All of this is all present, and God is creating it all for his good purposes. And so the formation of your mind, the existence of all of the things that go into what make up your thoughts, your previous experiences, all throughout the entirety of your life. So, like, as things occur to you, so when you pray and conform your mind to God's knowledge, and then something occurs to you, for example, you remember something that is directly about and gives you an answer to the thing that you're wondering about. It can be far less direct than this. It can take far more time. I'm not saying that all such prayer always gets answered in this fashion. I'm just using this kind of thing that gives because it's nice and concise and compact. The same thing applies to other things, which just take a lot longer. And my videos are already too long. So in this one particular case where, like, let's say you are praying about something, you don't understand why it is that somebody was allowed to do something, for example. And then, as you are praying to God about this, something occurs to you which helps to put this in a different context, which gives you a bit more understanding. You remember something that you hadn't really been thinking about. Something, a person said to you 15 years ago just like pops into your head because it actually fits here and gives you insight into the thing. Well, you have to understand that this is, in fact, God answering a prayer, because God made all of these things. God put that person in your life saying this thing. This moment was just as present to God as the person 15 years ago saying the thing is present. And the relationship between these two things and your prayer is equally present to God. We see these things all as highly contingent and disconnected from each other and can barely remember anything. But every single aspect of every single moment being present to God, having a person there saying a thing to you in that time, and you having a mind that recalls this in this moment in this prayer, is part of God's providential ordering of the world in response, amongst all of the other things that go into it, in response to your prayer. So that this is not the fact that there is some natural aspect to this as well, that you don't merely hear a voice from the a voice from the clouds, doesn't mean that the prayer is not being answered in its fullness, but rather that God likes to, very evidently, if you look at the world, God likes what is technically called secondary causation, but which I prefer to call delegation. God likes to give it to creation to be part of God's action within creation, so that God can, by becoming part of God's love in giving reality to creation, we become part of God's love. And so God brings us up, lifts us up, and makes us a part of himself by making us a part of his love in his love for creation. And so all of the things that take part in this answering, which is not the same as merely thinking on the subject. To merely think on the subject is not the same thing as to pray to God about the subject. Although there is a sense eventually, and this is where the admonition that we should pray always. There's in Bishop Barron's video, somebody, I think he cited Kierkegaard, who said the saint is a person whose life is about one thing, and he also mentioned that praying is, he cited somebody who said praying is finding the center, your center where you are here and now being created by God. sort of joining the two of them, that he didn't quite phrase it this way, which is kind of a pity, just for the aesthetics of it. But the saint is a person whose life is a prayer. Is kind of a neat way of putting that. But more to the point, the fact that it is, in a sense, possible to pray always, not verbally, obviously, but that all of your actions and all things that you consider is to consider them in their right relationship to God. That we always tend to lose sight of the fact that the world is about God, that every table, chair, speck of dirt, bird, tree, distant star, all of these things are in us are fundamentally about God. And we tend to forget this in our dealing with them. We tend to think that salt is about salt, not about God. And so, no, that's not to say that salt isn't salt. You can go to you can lose sight of things in the other way. It is possible to forget that salt is salt that is about God. And you can just think this is about God, but forget that there's the salt there that is the salt that is about God. That is to say, you have to keep in mind that all of creation is real and is important and is about God. And that the core of its being is being about God, its relationship to God. And because all goodness is being, this is one of those. If you just think through the fact that truth, goodness, and beauty, the three transcendentals are the same thing, just considered differently, it all just falls straight out of that. If you just examine ethics, and true ethics consists of essentially maximizing being, making things what they truly in fact are. It just all falls out. So I don't have time to work through it here, but trust me, if you have the time to put a lot energy into this, that will get you there. That's the way to do it. That's the way to get there. I mean, okay. Anyhow, so it is possible to make your entire life a prayer wherein, for all things, you are regarding them in their relationship to God, and as such, your mind would be continuously conformed to the truth of God's understanding of all things. So you could, in theory, we're all fallen creatures, so we don't actually do it, but in theory you can do that. And so you do not need to be specific. If you can do this, if you can regard all things as they fully, in the fullness of their being, which includes the fact that they are fundamentally about God, that God is the beginning and the end in the sense of like telos, the natural end, the thing towards which they're directed, of all things, then, and that's what I mean when I say that they're about God, then you would, in all times and all things that you are doing, whether you're brushing your teeth or whether you're baking bread or whether you're talking to a person, you would in all things have your mind conform to the truth of God's knowledge of these things. And so you would in that sense be praying to, continuously and in all things that you do. And so words specifically said to God would become superfluous, because you wouldn't need to tap into that way of conforming your mind to the truth of God's knowledge anymore, because your mind would continuously always be conformed to the truth of God's knowledge, and so you wouldn't have to take a separate action to fix what is not correct, because it would be correct. So that would be possible, and in some sense, because that is the that is the thing working correctly. That's the thing that, that if the thing worked correctly, that would solve all of the difficulties essentially. And so understanding that and the relationship of the things to what they should be helps you to solve the various difficulties in terms of, that aspect of talking to God. Okay, so the next one is that I want to handle is petitionary prayer. What is it? And there's several different several different ways you can look at the intellectual problem of petitionary prayer. And one of them, I really like, I think it's in God in the Dock, there's a really short essay, in some senses about umbrellas, where C.S. Lewis was talking about this, where somebody said that he doesn't, petitionary prayer doesn't really make any sense to him, because doesn't God know better than us how the world should be organized? And C.S. Lewis, retorted, it's reasonable enough, but do you always leave the umbrella at home because God knows, better than you whether or not you should be wet? And he said, well, obviously not, but that's different. And C.S. Lewis pointed out, well, actually, it isn't. The fact that it's kind of strange that God lets us do anything at all, but given that He lets us do anything at all, prayer is the same kind of thing as any other action that we take, where if we do something from our will, we are necessarily making a choice ourselves. Now, the ideal, of course, always is that the choice we'd make is the best possible choice, which is the choice that God wants us to make. Those being the same thing, because God gives us our nature and so on, and gives being and goodness and being, and all our, if we're making the best choices, they're directed towards goodness and goodness of being, etc. So, as I said, as I alluded to before, the solution to this one is in the nature of delegation, or technically secondary causation. That God gives it to us to take part in the act of creation, and in so doing, God gives it to us to become part of God's love. Now, petitionary prayer is just like passing somebody the salt, except it's less direct. In when you pass somebody the salt, when you give somebody hungry man a loaf of bread, when you teach somebody who doesn't know something that is true, in all of these things, you're taking part in making their being. In petitionary prayer, you're doing the same thing, but it's indirect rather than direct. Now, you can see something that's just like this in the same way that if I know that a man is hungry and I do not have any food myself, but my friend does have food that he can give to the hungry man, I could go and tell my friend, and my friend can go and give this man, the hungry man, food. And I have taken part in my friend's action of doing this by asking him to do this thing. I have taken part in his generosity. And as such, I have become part of my friend's generosity. And also, now, within the nature of co-equal finite creatures, my friend has also become, part of mine through my giving of him knowledge, etc. So, we become intermingled in this sense. But petitionary prayer has that same nature to it, that we are given to be able to channel certain aspects of God's love in particular ways. And this being a far less, direct and not a physical way, but still a very real way. And now another problem comes up for some people who study sufficient philosophy to be familiar with the consequences of the argument from, either from change, sometimes called motion, in the archaic use of the word motion. Because the archaic use of the word motion means change, and local motion was the change in location, but somehow motion came to mean nothing but local motion. That is to say, change in location. Kind of weird semantic drift over time there. So when we talk about like the Aristotelian argument from motion, it really more properly is the argument from change, or the argument from contingency and necessity, that God is unchanging and simple. And so the unchanging being really the key thing here, pure actuality from the argument from change. And so how is it that we can change what God does within the world if God is unchanging? And there's a great physical metaphor that can explain how this works, and that is to say lensing, a lens. So suppose there's a big, giant, technically miasma of incandescent plasma, but a big ball of fire up in the sky who shines light down on all things. And suppose you were to take a magnifying glass and stick it in front of the light shining down. And what would happen is this would concentrate all of the light on a small point if you hold it with the correct orientation, the correct distance away, etc., given the magnifying glass, such that one spot would become very hot because it's getting all of this visible light, and the rest of it would actually cool down and be, darker because the light that would be going to it was concentrated in one place. Now, have you changed the sun? No, you have not changed the sun. The sun is still 93 million miles away and shining its light out in a reasonably uniform sort of way. All physical metaphors, of course, always are imperfect. But you are nonetheless changing what the sun is doing, or changing how the sun interacts with the world, because you have been given this thing, this material called glass, or dependently optically clear plastic, which can change how the light is coming through. So you change how the sun interacts with things, though you are not in fact changing the sun. So now this is a physical metaphor, and physical metaphors for God are fraught with problems, so they can never be pushed too far. The only point of them is to give you some hint of the real sort of thing that is going on whenever you're talking about God and the world. It's not to be any sort of exact thing, but the problem that we have is that only one thing is like God, and that's God. And so we don't have anything else. We don't act like God except in certain very loose ways. And so, sometimes we can come up with ways of approaching this, but often, the ways we can approach this kind of reality is way less direct. So, no. By the way, just incidentally, there are things like this within just the physical world too. Like, how does one moment turn to the next within time? We don't have anything like the change of one moment into the next time wise. Like, how does one moment tick over into the next moment? How do things like change their configuration from one moment to the other? Like, in between the two moments, how do you get from the one moment to the other without stuff like moving around in between the moments? But then that would not be the next moment, that would be moments further on, and so on. How does that work? It's unlike our experience. It's unlike our normal experience. We cannot approach this directly. We can only approach it very indirectly. Or there's circumference of they're really, really weird things, by the way, about, like, say, like pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. There are all sorts of weird things in math that you can only approach, but you can't actually, you don't experience things like them. Normal language doesn't have the relevant concepts, and so you have to kind of try to build them up without going too far astray. This happens actually all the time. This is certainly not, our limitation in this regard is certainly in no way unique to God. It just happens to come up a lot with God because God is so unlike everything in creation. Or so not identical with anything in creation, I should say. Because things in creation are like God. They all necessarily are like some aspect of God, because that's where they get their being from, and hence where they get their likeness from. The only thing they could be like is like God. Although they can also be like other things within creation because, as previously mentioned, secondary causation or delegation. Anyway, be that part as it may. So how does petitionary prayer work in that sense? Well, I think lensing is a very good analogy to it, that by our prayer, we don't change God, but we do interpose ourselves between God and something else, in part, not fully. And as such, we can change, filter through ourselves the way that God is interacting with that other thing, creation, and thus, again, become incorporated into God's action. But this is how petitionary prayer can work with an unchanging God. It's essentially like lensing. Now, again, you can, God is intelligent and the sun isn't, and a magnifying glass isn't, and we are intelligent. So, don't push that too far, because two unintelligent things are only going to have very limited application to two intelligent things. Pardon me, and their interactions. But still, it's a way of approaching. So, okay, so that's how does what is petitionary prayer and how does it work? I think that is sufficiently covered to give insight into that. And then prayers of thanksgiving. So to express gratitude, this is, roughly speaking, just it's not identical with, but it has the same basic structure as talking to God. To be grateful to things, to thank God for things, is to recognize their goodness and to recognize that behind their goodness is the goodness of God. So if I thank God for vanilla ice cream, I am recognizing the goodness of vanilla ice cream, and I am recognizing that the goodness of vanilla ice cream comes from God giving vanilla ice cream its existence, and also giving me my existence, and giving me my abilities to appreciate the various goodness that is in vanilla ice cream. And so to thank God, again, it's again, we could pray, we can in theory pray always, and if we were to pray always, we would not need to take special time out to do this, because we would always be regarding all things exactly as they are, in the fullness of their goodness and the fullness of that relationship to God's goodness. And so in that sense, we would be praying continuously, but because we are fallen creatures and we get this wrong, we have to go and do something that is corrective. That if you're off balance to one way, you need to put something out further than just on balance in order to balance the two things out so that you don't fall over. Fallen creatures of our nature, we're imperfect, we get things wrong, and so we necessarily need to balance things out. And so tapping into our habits of expressing gratitude is to, and again, when we express gratitude, we put ourselves into a frame of mind where we understand the goodness of the thing given and also the goodness of the person who gave it. So if, you pass me the salt and I say, thank you, I am calling to mind the goodness that you have just engaged in. I am also, of course, expressing this to you, which is communicating this to you because you're a finite creature who doesn't already know it. But also what I'm doing is calling to mind your knowledge of your goodness and of my knowledge of your goodness and so on. So basically all the parts except for the communicative information are what we're doing, and we're just using our normal habits to balance out the way we, to go more to one side to balance out the screw up that we normally have. But that is essentially what a prayer of thanksgiving is conforming your mind to the reality of the goodness involved, such that you appreciate it, and in particular appreciate it within its connection to God. So again, obviously God doesn't lack anything. God doesn't need anything. Our thanks don't add anything to God. We exist for our sake. God has created us out of love in order to give more to us. God doesn't create us for himself, or to benefit himself in some way, because he can't be benefited. God is complete and full and lacks nothing of any kind. So the thing, just something that's important to remember is the fullness of God's love. That God is perfectly happy, but that God really, really loves us completely with the fullness of his being and the fullness of our being. So the people sometimes act as if there's something anemic in God not needing us, but it's actually, utterly and completely suffused with being. Much fuller than anything we can comprehend. So it's really very much the opposite of anemic, which is one reason, of course, that praying is helpful, because it helps to call to mind these things, because we can so easily get used to day-to-day stuff considered incorrectly and become misled. So that, I think, is all of the intellectual aspects of prayer. I'm going to be making other videos. I was asked about distractions during prayer and the validity of prayer. These things I will be talking about in separate videos, but I wanted to answer here, because it's already obviously longer than it should be, about just the nature of prayer, what it actually is. Like truly, if you dig down and consider it in its fundamental essence, what is it really? So hopefully this answers that question, and I'll have other videos talking about answering the other aspects of the question I was asked about prayer. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.